1 week from tonight, communities around the world will be reading the scroll of Esther on the holiday of Purim. Hard to believe that it's almost here. And as we reflect on hearing the scroll read for this particular holiday, Megillah, the Hebrew word for scroll, is one of the 4 acts of mindfulness that are connected to the holiday. So these, I call them kind of invitations to engage spiritually and to be playful in our awareness. So in addition to the Megillah, the scroll, or it's literally the invitation is to hear the story being read from a traditional scroll, we're also invited into the mindfulness practices, if you want to think of them this way, as mishloach manot, sending food gifts to others, mishteh, loosely translated as partying, and matanot le'avyonim, giving gifts to the poor. And all of these invitations to mindfulness are mentioned in the Purim story itself in the scroll. Yet at first glance, the book of Esther is really, some scholars feel, is really a novella. It's just a spoof. It's got buffoon-like characters, really impossible characters of people who might be challenging for us to identify with. And the most famous fun fact about the book is there's no mention of God. It's the only book in the Jewish Bible that has this unique characteristic. So Judaism, our tradition, is built on stories and narrative. It's how we learn. It's how we absorb the spirituality kind of into our bodies and souls. And stories form the basis of our holiday cycle. The giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai correlated with the festival of Shavuot, the Haggadah of our Passover Seder, the story of the Maccabees and Hanukkah, just to name a few. So through these stories about our ancestors and their families, we also learn about ourselves. The great scholar Danny Matt is best known as a superb teacher of the Zohar, a foundational text on Jewish mysticism, but he has also written on the power of narrative within ourselves. What stories do we tell about ourselves? And how do our stories unfold? As Rabbi Jenny Solomon mentioned last week, some of us were recently on an IJS Chavraya retreat. This is part of an alumni cohort for those of us who have gone through the clergy leadership program, one of IJS's most amazing programs. And we gathered in person and learned from our teacher, Nancy Flam. And she shared with us the following quote from Danny Matt's essay, Beyond the Personal God. And I'm going to ask Kat to share the resource sheet, and I'm going to be reading the entirety of all these quotes out loud. So if you don't have access to that, you can just take it in by listening. He writes, over our lifetime, in collaboration with our family and friends, we have woven a story about ourselves, a story that defines who we are. We do not consciously and deliberately figure out what narratives to tell and how to tell them. For the most part, we don't spin our tales. They spin us. I'm going to read the entire quote again to let it sink in a little bit. Over our lifetime, in collaboration with our family and friends, we have woven a story about ourselves, a story that defines who we are. We do not consciously and deliberately figure out what narratives to tell and how to tell them. For the most part, we don't spin our tales. They spin us. I love that line. We don't spin our tales. They spin us. When Danny Matt teaches this, he's not telling us that we have no agency over our lives, that we should throw our hands up in resignation or despair. I think what he's trying to tell us is to give ourselves over to not being completely in charge, to resist the urge to direct our stories, to give up the illusion of being the sole author of our narratives. At different times in our lives, we invest so much energy in the stories we create about ourselves, right up here in our heads. The ruminating rumblings of our minds connect the dots that seem to make sense and seem so real, and yet they are not. During our retreat, Nancy asked us, "What is the story that won't let me go?" It's a good question for us to ask today. What is the story inside of me that won't let me go, that won't let me release, that won't let me move forward or just be? But if we can release the sense of attachment of authorship in those stories, we can move toward the essence of Danny Math's teaching. We don't spin our tales, they spin us. We are a beautiful and unique tapestry of those unfolding narratives. So how do we come into a place spiritually where we can embrace that unfolding? As we prepare to sit today, I also thank Nancy for sharing this wonderful and playful poem, which I'm going to share in turn with you now. This is written by John Wellwood. Forget about enlightenment. Sit down wherever you are and listen to the wind singing in your veins. Feel the love, the longing, the fear in your bones. Open your heart to who you are right now, not who you would like to be, not the saint you're striving to become, but being right here before you, inside you, around you. All of you is holy. You are already more and less than whatever you can know. Breathe out, touch in, let go. And so now, with the Buddhist teaching in mind that goes like this, a nice dovetail with our poem, enlightenment comes by accident. Practice makes us more accident prone. So with carrying that, we will sit. So take your seat with dignity or settle into a position of awareness that works for your body today. Perhaps you're lying down, perhaps you're standing. There is, as our teacher Nancy tells, nothing to get and nothing to get rid of in this moment. There is nothing to get and there is nothing to get rid of. In the words of our poet, John Wellwood, you are already more and less than whatever you can know. And I will bring us back with some singing at the end of our sit. Di-di-di-di-di. Di-di-di-di-di. Ya-da-da-di-di-di-di. Yama-da. Ya-da-da-di-di-di-di-di-di-di-di-di-di-di-di-di. Di-di-di-di-di. Di-di-di-di-di. Yiddy-di-di-di-di-di-di-yada-di, yiddy-di-di-di-di-di-di-di-di, yiddy-di-di-di-di-di, yiddy-di-di-di-di-di-di-di-di-di-di-di-di-di-di-di-di-di. Yada, 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 yamba, da, da, da. Yada, yamba, da, 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 da. With gratitude to my teacher, Rabbi Nancy Flam, and to Rabbi Mark Margolius for this wonderful experience of the clergy leadership program that allowed me to share the teaching today. And thank you to Kat for holding our space. Early blessings for a Chag Sameach, a wonderful, joyous, and meaningful Purim holiday next week.
Thank you so much, Susan. Thanks, as always, for such a beautiful teaching and practice today. Friends, we seal that as we do every day, offering an opportunity for those of you who are in mourning, or if you're observing a yahrzeit, or if it's part of your custom to participate in Kaddish, to do so today, and to put the name or names of those you're honoring in the chat box now or after we recite Kaddish. And again, as always, if you're not reciting Kaddish, you have an opportunity to fulfill a mitzvah by helping to create a community of support and love for those who are in mourning, just by staying present and offering your kind and compassionate support to them. So thanks to Kat for sharing the words of the mourners Kaddish on the screen. Those who are reciting are invited to join me by rising in body or in spirit. And you can unmute at this time. Yitkadash, Amad Yivrach Yirute V'Yamlicha B'Chute Hayechon U'Yomechon Yehidecho Beit Yisrael Agala U'Zman Kariv V'Yomru Yeshmei Rabba Mibarach Amen. Brach Yitpa'ar V'Yidamam V'Yitzeh Yithadar V'Yidaleh V'Yithalal Kol Birchata V'Shirata Shbechata V'Nechamata Da'amiran La'ama Yehi Shlama Rabba Mishmaya V'Chaim Aleinu V'Yal Yisrael V'Yimru Amen. Yiseh Shalom B'Mamav Yiseh Shalom Aleinu V'Yal Kol Yisrael V'Yal Kol Yoshvei Tevel Amen.
Amen.
Friends, thanks so much for joining us today. And if you're leaving us now, we hope you'll join us tomorrow. Tomorrow will be led in practice by Yiska Smith, who'll be joining us from Jerusalem. And my colleague, Rabbi Josh Figelston, will be hosting tomorrow. On Wednesday, we'll be led for the first time by Rabbi Danielle Upman, who'll be joining us from Florida, wonderful Jewish mindfulness teacher who will be joining our teaching roster. Thursday, Rabbi Dr. Amira Neshama Weil will lead us. And on Friday, as always, Rebecca Schisler will lead us to sit into Shabbat together, Shabbat Zachor, as we prepare for Purim next week, as Susan so beautifully helped us look ahead and prepare for today. As always, you're invited to stay on, just continue sitting with this beautiful community for the next 15 minutes or so, if you'd like, or sharing reflections on your experience or questions about the teaching and the practice today. And if you are staying on and would like to ask a question, please preface it in the chat by writing question in all caps. And thanks, Barbara. Actually, this is my question too. Susan, thank you. First of all, thanks for, I'm getting a lot of nachas here, a lot of pleasure from the teaching from that retreat, kind of getting out into the world more widely. It's really a great thing. And I'm sure our friend Rabbi Nancy Flam would also really be quite happy about that. So thanks for that. And also reminding me of it. And also, so the question, I actually was going to see if you were interested in playing Rashi. We'll call it the Rashi game. You get to be Rashi. For those not familiar, Rashi's, the classic medieval Jewish commentator on Bible and Talmud, for that matter. When I say play Rashi, what I really mean is just like unpack or, explain a little bit more. So Barbara Drosnin, you have a great question there, but before we get to your question, I have a preliminary question, which is like, what do we mean by story? What's the Rashi on story? Like, can you just describe how you're using it? And then we can get into that question about, well, who's creating the story here and what's the role of the story also? So what is the story? What do you mean by story? What's the story?
So there are two things that come to mind, and one will make me chuckle a bit. But the first is, I think it's the persona that we try to create. I mean, I think the first thing that comes to mind is how many of us, myself included, engage in social media and kind of, if there's kind of a story, writing a bio. I mean, feeling like we have to communicate our value, the meaning of our lives to someone in all different kinds of formats. The other thing, and Mark, you'll smile about this. So when I first, before I came to my first retreat for the clergy leadership program, we were assigned a book on, I had no meditation practice when I applied for this particular program. And so they assigned us a book. It was wonderful, not a Jewish book, but a general approach to meditation. I'm blanking on the name of it, but Mark, you might remember.
Got it. It's 8 weeks to something. I'll grab it.
Yes, 8 weeks to meaningful, and it had wonderful links you could click through and act. So I was introduced to a term, or I guess it's a term, called daisy chaining. And I'm laughing because I wanted to bring it up today, but I subsequently discovered through a little bit of Googling that apparently daisy chaining has some sexual connotations at this point that have kind of emerged according to urbandictionary.com. So I decided not to use that in the teaching. But daisy chaining, as I learned it in that particular book on meditation, talks about how we link thoughts unhelpfully in our minds that might go something like this. I'm having a hard time concentrating today. Oh, I'm a bad meditator. Oh, that means I have a really short attention span. How could I possibly do my job? That's why I was having so much trouble this last week. And then on top of that, my partner told me that I wasn't really attentive to him. I am not a good person. I can't, right? And the whole thing daisy chains into this story that ends up really inhibiting us. Not true, not helpful. Those are my two examples, Mark.
Good ones. Thank you. Really good. I put that's it's also actually that book is a great resource. So I put it in the chat box for people to know about as well. So one of the things also that I learned when I was new to this, probably learned it from Sylvia Boorstein when I was first exposed to this, was this idea of, which was like, it's hard to imagine now, but like, it was like earth shattering for me to hear this, that not to, to notice the story and to not attach to it, right? Which is part of that process, that you were inviting us into of notice, am I writing this story or is the story emerging through me, right? And so that quote from Danny Matt, we don't spin our tales, they spin us. Well, let me get to Barbara's question because that was the preliminary. Let's see. I've been working for years to keep my stories from spinning me. and becoming the voice of my own stories. This teaching brings me pause. There's a question, Barbara, there. So if we get distance from the stories and say like, oh, these stories are just, the way I think of it is this, I just sort of notice that story, the thoughts are bubbling up and then the dots are connected like you just did, like the daisy chaining, right? Like, oh, I am not, I wandered away. Oh, and then a judgment about that. And then a whole story like I am, etc. And, like frequently it could be negative, like you were describing, or it could be positive, like, wow, I got a compliment. I'm the most amazing listener in the world, right? Um, about just finding who we are. But what's the second step once we realize that we are not in control of that? That is happening through us in some way. What do we do with when we notice the story that's playing out? I don't know, maybe you can speak just personally for yourself, because I think each of us probably has our own way of dealing with it. Like when you notice that happening, the daisy chaining, what's your practice for that? What do you try to do?
To remember that things are not fixed, that things are not just because they're the way they are in this moment, they are not going to be that way in another moment. And it's also liberating because if I've made poor choices or I'm afraid to commit and to make a choice, it can also remind me that just because I'm making this choice at this moment, it's not for all choices, perhaps, but for many, that doesn't mean that in 6 months or in 2 weeks, I will make the same choice. The other thing I wanted to say something quickly about the idea of spinning. So in the English, one thing it can connote is spinning around and around in kind of a fruitless way. And I think that if we take the word spin here and the way Danny Madish used it, it's in a creative way, like a wheel, right? Someone spinning at a wheel, and there's something linear and fluid about that. Not a tailspin. That's a real play on the words here, but not a spinning around fruitlessly, but like a spinning there is a tapestry being created. Somehow. It's a matter of who's like, how tight can you pull on that or push on it?
Right. I think it's interesting and also important here that at least in this context, I mean, people can understand this on a psychological level, right? Right. Or the subconscious, the unconscious is bubbling up through dreams and through our thought processes. But we're really talking about it as a spiritual process, almost like revelation, right? That's taking place. Something is being revealed through the story that emerges, which brings me to the second question. And where you started about bringing in Purim and the Jewish story, right? That the story that we live in, which emerges out of the Jewish experience in some way. I guess what I'm getting at here is on second glance, when we look at the story, right? Like you were just describing, oh, I just noticed a story that I'm telling about myself. Some of that is not true. That's not, right? Or I'm globalizing or generalizing from this one thing, right? I'm blowing it out of proportion, or I'm exaggerating here in some way. Because I can see more clearly, right? Wow, that's interesting. Like I'm quite self-critical, I'm like harshly self-critical. What's that about, right? And I can test that against other things that I seem to know to be true. How do we apply that same thing with the larger Jewish story? Like Ricky Lippitz wrote, don't you think it's a much older and very Jewish approach, not a negative one? I was raised in a family in which the stories of our biblical ancestors were told as if they were neighbors, and in some cases, heroes to be emulated, like Esther, right? Like, so, I mean, actually, the story of Esther in Megillah it's a good example because we've got like kind of the highs and the lows, right? We've got some beautiful aspects of that story and some very troubling aspects of Megillat Esther, which reveal both, like many different aspects of our personalities. So I don't know, do you see an analogy between in this practice, how we grow in awareness of the process of the story, like the kind of, like you were saying, like but basically letting go of control and saying, this is absurd. I am like, think that I can write my story. I think I can define who I am. It's absurd, right? I cannot possibly define myself. It's nothing is permanent. So, and maybe the same is true with how we work with the narratives and stories of Torah or the Tanakh, the Bible as a whole, right? Do you see that as comparable in some way?
I think that's the beauty of Parshat HaShavua, the weekly Torah portion, right? Is the idea is, yeah, this is always the same, but we're different, right? So I think where things become ossified is when we have this perception or understanding of the story and we cling to that, and then it doesn't allow room for what it might mean in the future. By the way, we do this with people too, right? We do it with rabbis, we do it with cantors, we do it with other leaders, where we say this person is, that's this person's the guru. She's the one I connect to, so I can't connect to other, right? It's kind of other people. I was thinking too about one of the other ways this plays out for me in relationships, and I think we can apply it to our biblical neighbors also, is, when we're in relationship with someone and they do something and we think, oh, okay, that's what they do when this happens.
Mm-hmm.
And then we begin to predicate our own behavior on that expectation. When I leave the fridge open, that really irritates my husband. Well, just because it irritated him that one day doesn't mean that I should put him in that box for the future.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so I'm bringing that back to our own, because I think we also do that with literature or with biblical characters, in addition to what we do in our lives, is we put them in boxes and then it turns us, it just closes doors to understanding how things can shift and change, and people aren't static.
Mm-hmm.
The characters in Purim aren't static either.
Right. Well, I think this is good because this is a corrective. I want to make sure, like, I think Ricky, you're noting that, sometimes the examples can be negative examples of stories, but there can be positive, definitely positive examples too. And I think where we're landing here is about realizing that stories emerge from a source that's deeper than us, right? They're beyond us in some way, and we are bearing witness to it. So the poem that you read, which I'm going to, if you don't mind, Susan, I'm going to invite you to end by reading it again and hopefully letting us absorb it and bringing it into the rest of our day as a kind of Havdalah for our sit today, is not that we shouldn't, co-author our stories or co-author our people's story, right? We are active participants in writing that story, and not being defined by others also too, right? Not letting others to write our story for us. And at the same time, recognize that we're part of a much larger process by which that story is emerging through us and among us, and that's, like you said, that's really part of the power of the study of Parshat HaShavua, is immersing in our people's story through the lens of our own personal experience and our own story. And much more to say about all of this than in 15 minutes, obviously. But thank you so much, Susan, for this, for bringing this out today, and deeply appreciate it. If you don't mind, it would be great if you would.
I don't mind. And might be an answer to Diana's question earlier in the chat about joy, about the difficulty of being joyful during the month of Adar. I think
Right.
what answers is in the poem. Forget about enlightenment. Sit down wherever you are and listen to the wind singing in your veins. Feel the love, the longing, the fear in your bones. Open your heart to who you are right now, not who you would like to be, not the saint you're striving to become, but the being right before you, inside you, around you. All of you is holy. You are already more and less than whatever you can know. Breathe out, touch in, let go. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you so much, Susan, as always, for just a beautiful practice today and leading off the week for us, this week of practice. a week into Purim. I neglected to mention at the outset that just a reminder that next week, Rebecca Schistler will be leading us all week on a theme of playfulness and cultivating joy in connection with Purim. So, and people should be prepared if you are so inclined to come in costume on Tuesday for Purim, and throughout the whole week if you'd like. So thanks to you, Rabbi Susan Leider, for leading us beautifully today, and for Kat Esposito for holding our space, and above all, each of you for being here as always to create this beautiful community of practice.